Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is Tuesday, August 22nd, 2023. Tonight's format, if you're not familiar with how we do this, every other broadcast is a live question and answer. You can always send questions in, whether you're a listener or a watcher. You can always send questions into webinar@evoketherapy.com. If you are an alumni or a current client of ours, you can listen and watch live. If you're not, you can listen to the recorded episodes on your favorite podcast app or on our YouTube channel. Before I get into the pre-submitted questions, I just want to make the announcement of the upcoming Conscious Parenting Seminar. This is an all-day workshop that I host with a limited number of participants. So I take your live questions. I have some education. We have some breakout sessions, and we keep it small enough so that it's more of a dialogue, not just education, not just me talking at you or even responding to your written word, but actually you're going to be a part of the class. You're going to be a part of the Zoom class that we host here. The next iteration of this is September 29th. It goes from 9:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. Mountain Time. We'll take 1 hour for lunch. This goes by really fast. I really enjoy these. It's $400 per person. It's $700 for a couple if they share a screen. If you'd like to register or find out more, email intensives@evoketherapy.com or call 866-411-6600. Look forward to hosting that. I know it's going to fill up soon. All right, folks. I'm going to get to my first pre-submitted questions. You can submit questions at any time. Olivia, who is doing the moderating for us this evening, will put those in the order that they're received. But let me get to the pre-submitted questions. First parent writes in and says this: I was wondering if you might help clarify how to think about boundaries and consequences and their relationship to each other. Here's a specific example of how I get confused. Part one: my 14-year-old daughter is at home, unlike her older brother who was at a wilderness program and now is in a residential treatment center. She is refusing to do something that we, as her parents, have decided is in her best interest to do, specifically to go to a 3-day academic program at a new high school intended to introduce her to ninth grade, her teachers, etc. She has learning differences, and this short program is for kids entering the ninth grade with learning disabilities. She has stated that she will not go and that we cannot physically make her. We agreed that we cannot physically force her to go, but that we have decided, based on our best guess as parents, that this would benefit her, and it is our expectation that she will attend. Part two: we have decided that if she doesn't go, she will lose her phone for those 3 days, and she will miss two specific things she would like to do that are an enormous inconvenience for us. I'm trying to figure out the framework for understanding our two responses. They are not threats to make her go, but a statement of what will happen if she doesn't. For example, consequences. But are they or should they be an expression of our boundaries? That is, that her non-compliance was something that we think is important, even if we are wrong about that, exhausts our capacity to give her the privilege of the phone and or rearrange our schedule for these two events. Or is a consequence just a consequence and you don't have to think about it further? Part three: I take seriously what you say about how one's approach to one's children, one's mindset is the key, and I get confused in situations like these. I would welcome any thoughts or clarification you can provide. First of all, let me address the initial question in your submission. The difference between a boundary and a consequence is fairly unimportant and inconsequential. A boundary is essentially, or it starts off with the idea of who am I, what do I need, what do I feel comfortable with, given this specific context, right? If I work as a security guard at a jewelry store, I'm going to have different boundaries within that context. If I'm married to a partner, I'm going to have boundaries related to that context. If I'm a parent of a 10-year-old or a 19-year-old or a 30-year-old, my boundaries will be somewhat determined or in reference to the contexts of those situations. So boundaries are just what we're comfortable with. And the consequences kind of become the next step, right? If I'm a security guard at a jewelry store and I have a boundary that I'm going to be ethical, I'm going to be honest, I'm going to be diligent in my job, and you steal something when you walk in, then the consequence is going to be that I'm going to trip the alarm or approach you or call the police. So it's just an extension of the boundary. If you're 19 years old and you come into my home and you're using drugs and you're being belligerent and you're being unkind, I'm going to ask you to leave. I'm not comfortable with that language. I'm not okay with being spoken to that way, treated that way. I'm not comfortable with you coming in intoxicated, for example. And so the consequence is that I'm going to ask you to leave. And of course, those consequences could escalate as we go along. So, but the distinction isn't really important between those two. And really, when you say at the end of your part two, is the consequence just a consequence and you don't have to think about it any further about it? In essence, the simple answer is yes. I mean, that's that. You don't get to be right. I mean, the whole transformation of this process in parenting and in coupleship, in relationships, in life, the whole transformation is the move away from am I right? Am I good? Is my opinion justified? Versus this is what I feel comfortable with, and this is what I'm going to as a consequence of that. This is what I'm going to say. This is what I'm going to do. This is what I'm going to handle it. So it's the transformation from being right and good to being a person, to be a self, to be who you are. And as I say all the time, you don't get to be right anymore in this way of thinking. You don't get to win, to come out on top, but you do get to be a self, which is so much better. And if you were to get into psychotherapy, if you were to get into support groups for codependency, for Al-Anon, meaning that you have somebody in your life that's struggling with serious self-sabotaging behaviors like alcohol abuse, the principle that they would learn with you is essentially that you get to say no. No is a complete sentence, they say. You get to set the boundary where you feel comfortable with, and you don't have to justify yourself. You don't have to explain yourself. We're so used to, as children, feeling like we have to justify our decisions, our boundaries, our opinions, what we want, what we like. And we continue that later in life when we become partners and if we become parents, we continue that idea that everybody has to justify themselves. But the vulnerability to that is that that person becomes susceptible to debate, right? It's as if they have to be right. They have to have the right answer. They have to defend the boundary, defend it. So you get to decide. You get to decide what your line in the sand is. It sounds like from your description of things that the consequences that you've come up with as a result of your boundaries, of your values, of what you believe and think. And I love that you say whether we're right or not, that stance that you've taken and the consequences that you've suggested, they sound reasonable and fair to me. They don't sound like you're being triggered. The question starts to become, as we have boundaries and enforce them with consequences and behaviors, is are we still trying to control the other person? Are we still trying to, like the example that I use is, this is a very trivial, light example, but imagine eating dinner with a young child who's refusing to eat their chicken and their peas, right? They're refusing their vegetables and their protein that you prepared for them. And you say to them, if you don't eat your chicken and your peas, you don't get to have dessert. That's a boundary. That's a consequence related to the boundary that you have, the value that you have, what you believe is your duty, your responsibility, your role in the situation. That's okay. That's fine. When it starts to look like control in the example that I give, and I think everybody's somewhat familiar with this in relationships, is it would look like this when it starts to get into control. You would say to the child the thing I already said, which is you can't have ice cream for dessert. We're all having ice cream. You can't have it. And if the child still refuses, you would say something like, it's chocolate chip your favorite? Don't you want to be big and strong like your big sister? Eat it right now. Julia, eat your eat your chicken and peas right now. You start to escalate, you start to get angry, you start to control them. In a sense, a healthy boundary is, here's the option, here's the choice, here's my value, here's my stance, and you can choose either way. In other words, in a sense, the boundary and its consequence work whether the child or the individual complies or not. If you come to my house drunk and belligerent, I'm going to ask you to leave. So you can come drunk and belligerent. You're allowed to, but then you're going to be asked to leave. And if you don't leave, I'm going to escalate that consequence, that boundary. It may even escalate to the point, if you're becoming physically threatening and intimidating, that I may call the police. We might have a domestic violence situation on our hands. I'm not saying that all things will escalate, but just to further the thought experiment. Now, the difference is when we argue, when we debate, when we plead, when we beg, when we threaten, when we nag, when we repeat ourselves, when we guilt, when we shame, that's when it starts to look like control. But a boundary is a boundary, and its consequence is it's kind of cousin. It's relation. They relate to each other. So what you're saying sounds reasonable, and then to question your own boundaries, ask yourself, am I doing something that am I trying to control something that I don't need to control? Is there a natural consequence? Am I willing to both suffer the consequence naturally myself and allow my child to suffer the natural consequence themselves? And I can tell you that I have been all over the page with that. I don't have the same approach to my third child that I do to my fourth child. I don't have the same approach to my second child. To my second child, these are adults now, the older ones, that I did to my first child, and so on and so forth. You can have different positions, different feelings, different ideas, different boundaries and consequences based on the context, and you have that right. And as you do this work, mom and dad, as you do this work, you get more clear about where you stand and where others stand, and what's your relationship to them in this process. And you might become more liberal and open with your boundaries. They might be different from person to person. They might be different how you feel that day. They might be different about how that person, regarding how that person is doing in their life, right? A child who's excelling in school and seems to be well adjusted, I might have a different boundary with them if they want to skip that 3-day orientation than a child who's struggling. If there's a psychological issue there, I might respond differently, right? If they have severe anxiety. I guess part of the thought that I have is, what's the resistance about? Not just what she says it's about, but what she says it's about, and what do you really think it's about? That could alter your decision. But the fact of the matter is, you get to decide, and you don't get to be right. I was going to say you don't have to be right, but better said, you don't get to be right anymore. And children, they can deal with varying levels of strictness. I've seen this in our programs. Children can adapt and adjust to really high levels of structure. What they don't respond well to and have a difficult time adapting to is unclear communication, guilt, shame, right? They don't respond to the psychological dynamics in and around boundaries and consequences that are coercive and confusing, dishonest, unclear. That's the part that they have a difficult time adjusting to. So when parents ask me what's the right level of structure, my response often is, a whole range of possibilities exist that could be helpful and healthy for you and for your child. But what doesn't work is when you speak to them in this way. When you shame them, when you guilt them, when you threaten them, when you nag them, when you trick them, when you don't say what it's really about, when you try to sell them on the boundary. That's a big deal. So many of us, in fact, that's probably one of the most common errors that parents make in parenting, is they try to sell the if I can sell my child on the boundary, if I can get them to believe it, to like it, to not be mad at me for enforcing it, right? The consequence is the enforcement of the boundary. If I can get them to not be angry or upset with me, to kind of identify with the philosophy that I'm taking, that I'm approaching in this situation, then the issue is, then I don't have to do my work. I don't have to do the most difficult thing in life for most of us, which is to set a boundary and to stand up for it. So we ask when we try to talk our children into things, when we try to get them to believe what we believe, to subscribe to our philosophy, to not be upset, to not be sad or angry, we're really abdicating our responsibility as parents. We're outsourcing our personal development and placing that responsibility onto the child. We're making them responsible for our egos, for our development, for our sense of self. That is a really, really heavy burden for a child. And that none of that comes out in your question, but those are related concepts, related ideas. Thanks for the question. Great question. Next question that's sent in is written. It says this: what do you do when two spouses' boundaries conflict after doing their work? My wife got really involved in therapy after sending our son to Therapeutic Wilderness and listening to your podcast and using BetterHelp therapy. She has since become cold, and we don't have open communication as we have as every discussion is framed in therapy speak. It has affected our relationship negatively. How do you balance one individual's boundaries with the family's need to communicate? That's a really great question. It's really great because it's difficult and it's nuanced. The first thought that comes to mind that's obvious to me is if you can come together in a couples therapy session or a co-parenting therapy session to talk it out. If you can have enough safety in that structure to get beyond the surface level therapy skills and tools, right? The second thought that comes to mind is it's a very common stage in this personal transformation work that we do, that people will initially weaponize and become rigid around the skills and the tools, right? There's this overcompensation. I love it in Harriet Lerner's book on boundaries, my favorite book on boundaries. In fact, I would even recommend that you consider reading or listening to Harriet Lerner's book, The Dance of Anger, the one that I'm talking about. And she says that the first stage often is the obnoxious phase. And I've shared stories where I go into the obnoxious phase. I respond bluntly, coldly, right? I can't do it gracefully, naturally, with patience. It's the way that a novice responds to new insights and new skills and new tools. That could be the case, but here's where it gets a little bit tricky. It could also be the case, and I don't know her and I don't know you, but it could also be the case that she is expressing her boundaries clearly. She is using these tools in a natural way, in a less inexperienced way, in a more experienced way, in a healthy way. And you could be interpreting those as cold. You see, if a family system is used to this level of enmeshment, and I'm holding my hands up, if you're not watching the video, I'm holding my hands up, clasped together tightly. If that's a family's version of connection, right? Overlapping, gripping on tightly. If families move towards, or one person in a family moves towards this level of connection, and now I have my two hands touching each other, but not clasping each other, right? If I take a step back in relationship, oftentimes other people in the family will accuse me of being cold, of being rigid, of using therapy speak. So sometimes our reaction is because the proximity, the emotional proximity has changed. The sensibility has been altered. So for everybody on earth, virtually, if a person moves from less differentiated, less individuated, to more differentiated and more individuated, which, by the way, also makes them available to a greater and deeper level of intimacy. But if they move to become more differentiated or more individuated, the people around them, the family members around them that are used to their old way of being, will accuse them of being cold, of being abandoning, of being rigid, of using therapy speak to justify distance and punishment and manipulation. That happens all the time. When I teach parents about enmeshment and I start teaching parents about boundaries with children, the children inevitably will accuse the parents of not caring, of not loving, which is essentially the same kind of thing that you're saying. So part of it could also be that she's getting healthier and you're not used to that new positioning. I'm not saying it is. I'm not saying it is. It could be the first thing about the novice use of tools and skills and insights, and being a little bit clumsy about it and overcompensating, kind of swinging the pendulum the other way. So, with all of that analysis, my thought is you go into therapy. Go to her therapist together if they will see you. Go to your therapist if you have one, if they will see you. Go to a neutral new therapist, couples therapists, if those two things don't work, and try to find out how can we blend this together, and be open. This is a great question. Be open to the fact that you might be reading it, misreading it, or reading it through the lens of the old way of thinking and seeing. So part of it could be her and part of it could be you. It could be 90% one, 10% the other, or vice versa. But know this, that virtually everybody in a family system, whether that be just two partners or two or a couple, a marriage, in virtually all systems, all family systems, if somebody becomes more differentiated, more individuated, they will get accused of being unhealthy and ridiculous. They'll be attacked. The system will want them to go back to the way that it was, to maintain what we call homeostasis in systems. And so part of it is to understand, is there something going on here that I'm not seeing, that I'm not a part of it? Or do I need to just know that at first that my partner, in this case, my wife in this case, that these early stages are going to look like this because she's been neglecting her boundaries all this time? And that's kind of the questions that I would go into in my own therapy if I were you. Ask the questions, give examples, and be open to difficult answers in the process. That's a really great question, an extraordinarily common question. And if you're on the other side of it, same thing. Remember, the first ingredient in if you were making a dish, and the dish we call this dish intimacy and connection. The first ingredient in this dish is two individuated people. I'm not talking about hyper individualism. I'm talking about healthy individuation. I'm me. I know who I am. I know what I want, believe, think, feel. I know who I am, essentially. That's the first ingredient in the deepest, most profound kind of intimacy. So the great paradox is we have to move away to get closer. Because just giving you what you want, just being subject to your opinions, your whims, just behaving the way that you think that I should, just saying things that you want to hear, everybody knows that list that I just uttered. Everybody knows that's not real intimacy. It can be simply stated the way that a gentleman said at a wedding that I was at 20 years ago. He stood up at the wedding breakfast to give a toast to the couple. He was some older relative in the family, and he said, if you're not fighting with each other, then one of you is an idiot. Intimacy is the result of two individuated, differentiated individuals. People who are less individuated, less differentiated, they have a pseudo intimacy. They have more of a oneness or a blending or a loss of self in the other. Think about it like you have something that you want to say or a stance that you want to take with somebody to help a friend move, and you're clear in your mind about that. But you imagine yourself saying that to the friend and fearing whether or not they're going to be angry, they're going to punish you, they're going to guilt you, they're not going to be your friend anymore. And so you just go along with it, or you lie about it and say that you're sick when you're really not. That's not real intimacy. That's not really coming to the relationship as a person. That's just trying to avoid conflict. So Great questions. Great questions. Next person writes in and says this: my daughter has been at Evoke for 3 weeks. She was addicted to vaping, but she was also addicted to her phone. She's used her phone for dangerous things like running away with people she doesn't know. I've seen how my daughter's personality changed when she's not on her phone. She's a different person. Addiction runs in the family. What advice do you give for the parents of kids leaving the program? Whew. I have clear advice for you, but it's probably not along the lines of what you're asking, but I'll get to that. My advice for people leaving the program is do your work. Attend your Al-Anon meeting. I thought about this today. I was talking to somebody about this. In situations like this, I would say to an individual, to a parent, in this case, or a partner, if it was a similar kind of scenario, I would say try going to Al-Anon, try to going to Codependence Anonymous, try going to Families Anonymous. What people hear who have no understanding of what the program is, who aren't in recovery, what people hear when I suggest that is that if you go to Al Anon, which was created initially for the spouses, in fact, initially it was for the female spouses of the male alcoholics. That was its origin. The wives of the founders got together and started talking about their situations, right? It's expanded far beyond that, but that's kind of where it started. When I suggest that people go to Al Anon or Codependence Anonymous, I think what they naturally hear or think or imagine is, oh, that's a good, that if they're open to it, okay, that's where I go to figure out how to change this person, how to fix their addiction. Right? That's the draw. That's the carrot, if you will, that brings people into it. Then you get into those meetings, and if the meetings start to make sense to you and they start to sink into your bones, then you realize the three C's that they talk about. You can't control the other person, you didn't cause the addiction, and you can't cure it. You start to realize things like I said earlier, no is a complete sentence. You start to realize at a fundamental level that I don't get to be right anymore, but I do get to be myself. And then that's enough. You start to realize why you didn't know that already and where the wounding happened in your life. You start to see the patterns in your family of origin around boundaries and selfhood. And you start to realize that this is a deeper and broader concept and set of principles than you ever imagined. You start to see that you have your own disordered thinking. You have your own disorder, your own disease. And if it really gets deep into your soul, you realize that this is the way to liberation is to work on yourself, to work on your trauma. You start to realize that you're the cause of your own unhappiness, not the addict that you love, not the person struggling with alcohol abuse that you love or phone addiction or whatever it is. You start to live by the principle of keep your side of the street clean. What other people think about you is none of your business. You start to realize maybe the most core principle of that kind of program is that my serenity, my peace is my responsibility. And with all of that learning and awareness, as it becomes embodied in you, you start to respond to people differently. And here's the magic, and I almost can't say this to you. This is really close to a violation of the entire program, but I'm going to say it to illustrate. You start to realize that as you show up in these different ways because of what you're learning and how you're growing and expanding and being born again, you start to realize how you've participated in the addiction or the issues that underlie the addiction. Your change doesn't cure the addict, but you stop feeding the addiction. You stop co-participating in the addiction. You stop becoming a source of the problem or fuel for the flame. And you get clear and you find serenity and peace. And you find differentiation. And you know where you stop and they start. And it goes back to the principles in the journey of the heroic parent, which are, some of them are, that parenting, the outcome of healthy parenting is not well-behaved children. The outcome of healthy parenting is its own reward. It's peace, it's clarity, it's confidence. It's the absence of anxiety, it's serenity, it's courage. You start to realize something completely different, that there's a whole new world. So, having said all of that, go, that's my advice. Go understand your participation. The great gift, everybody, the great gift of this work, the great gift of this program, the great gift of this podcast is the realization that the symptom that is being displayed in the other person, in a system, is a sign that the entire system is off, that it's deeper and more shared than we could possibly imagine. And it's not about blame or who's responsible, or if you've getting in recovery for codependency doesn't fix the addict. Getting in recovery for codependency just fixes the codependency. And that fix starts to have a more positive impact on the people around you, right? Changing your parenting and becoming healthier doesn't fix anybody else, it fixes you. But that change, the change in you, makes a big difference in the system. But if we have ego invested in this and we say things like, it's not my fault and I don't have a problem and I've been successful and I'm not the one with the addiction and I'm not the immature 16-year-old in this case, and this doesn't apply to me, you know, the ego comes into it and we don't go or we resist it, then we go throughout life becoming confused, and we go looking, continue to look for people who will tell us, give us hacks or tools to fix other people in their lives, and we don't know that is our active addiction. That's what it looks like. So thank you. Great question. Applies to a lot of people, a lot of situations. Next person writes in and says, Part 1, my 20-year-old son attended Evoke 3 years ago, followed by a therapeutic boarding school. His main issue is smoking marijuana. He doesn't have major underlying issues, although he's diagnosed with anxiety in later teen years. Since he turned 18 and refused any further treatment, he has been smoking pot, engaging in other destructive behavior like dealing drugs occasionally. He is smoking a very high THC level pot, I think around 95% THC. Probably not that, but I hear you. Which causes him to lay on the couch all day smoking and nothing else. We have maintained the position with him that we believe that smoking pot is destructive in his life and will not enable it by providing any financial support. But we're there for him with any emotional support and will pay for treatment. Part 2. In the last year, he went through a period where he stayed sober for 6 months, got back into school, and worked to support himself. We agreed to help him to support him given the changes he made. He moved near our home and started smoking pot again within 3 weeks of moving back and engaged in the same destructive behavior. So we will cut off our financial support. My question is, how do we continue to support him emotionally? Please let me know any other recommendations you have. Thank you so much for all that you do. Great question. You know, so many of these questions, especially when they get to the point where you're curious about what you should do. And that's in big quotes, what you should do. I can't tell you. And this work is really what I've learned about therapy and psychology and mental health as I've grown up in this field is that it's not about what you do, but it's about transforming who you are, discovering who you are, becoming who you are, becoming more authentic and more clear. And I don't get to decide what you do. I'm going to answer your question in a moment, but I want to take this little detour first. You might have heard this story. It's from my book. Well, no, I don't know if it's in one of the books or not. I can't remember actually, but I'm going to tell it to you anyway. I tell it once in a while to illustrate. I was at a conference teaching about codependency to a group of professionals. A psychologist, female psychologist, raised her hand during the workshop and asked me the question. She heard something from me that she concluded, and she said, Brad, How can you suggest to us that we tell a mother to kick her opiate addicted son out of the house when the potential consequence of that is death? And I apologized and said, if I implied that or suggested that, I'm sorry. I would never suggest that. I would try to help that mother heal and sort out her own codependency, her own sense of self, her own boundaries. I would try to help her heal her attachment wounds from her own childhood. I would help her to get clear about who she is and what that means in relationship to this question. Then she would decide. And if she decided as she entered into recovery, her recovery became more robust, that she was going to let her son live at home, I would support it without hesitation. And if she decided that she was going to set the boundary and ask her son to leave the home, I would support her without hesitation. I would not get involved in the decision because it's not my son and it's not my life. And I don't have to live the rest of my life with the consequence of his or life or death. And so for me to take on that responsibility it's a huge mistake, both for me and for her. So when people say, and I hear people quote me as a result of these podcasts, in this situation, Brad would tell you to do X or Y, to make X or Y decision. You can trust that they're not adequately quoting me or interpreting me, because I wouldn't tell you what to do. The mother that said that she refused to test her young adult daughter when she came home from treatment because it would trigger her own relapse into her own codependency was perfectly appropriate, was coming from a healed place. The mother who asked me if she should bring cigarettes to her daughter after the program, her young adult daughter that was of legal age to smoke cigarettes. And the mother asked me the question, should she do it? And I said to her, this was in my first book, I could see you coming with the cigarettes and giving them to your daughter and saying, I'm giving you this. And with this gesture, I'm saying that I give up trying to control whether or not you smoke or not. I could also see you saying, showing up without the cigarettes and saying to your daughter, I'm not comfortable with you smoking. Whether you smoke or not is your decision, but I'm not going to participate in the purchase and the delivery of the cigarettes myself. I don't feel comfortable with that. So do you see how each decision isn't the issue, but it's where it's coming from? If it's coming from a place of fear, of control, of anger, of rage, of shame, of guilt, it's impossible, almost impossible to get it right. If it's coming from a place of love, of courage, of clarity, of surrender, which means accepting what you can control and what you can't control, it's really hard to get it wrong. So the decision isn't the thing. We are not simply our behaviors, right? Our behaviors are evidence of what's going on and who we are, but that's not what we're not just those behaviors. It's about where we're coming from. And it's, people could make the same decision or the different decision, and the valuation of that decision will be based on where they're coming from. I read a quote just today that said, how do you possibly know whether or not somebody's done the wrong thing if you don't know their reason? It was a philosopher in this post that I saw on social media. The same is true of psychology. It depends on where it's coming from. It depends on your relationship to the person, your relationship with the issue, your relationship with yourself, your relationship with shame and fear and guilt and control. So, with all of that, I think what I would say is take that work that you're doing. I would encourage, again, I know I'm a broken record with this, especially tonight. Go to therapy, go to the support groups that I mentioned at the end of every broadcast, Al-Anon Coda, Families Anonymous, Adult Children of Alcoholics, etc. Go to support groups, understand your own issues and how they're brought to bear in these situations. In the meantime, you're gonna have to make a decision one way or the other, and ideally, we try to express love and companionship. We try to be present. I remember I alluded to this story. I was watching a workshop many years ago, and a psychologist was demonstrating this principle where he was having lunch with his adult daughter who was suffering from addiction. And he sat down with her at lunch and he said, "I'm glad to see you. I'm glad you're willing to have lunch with me." And she asked him for money, and he refused to give her money based on the circumstances. And what he said in this role play for parents, he said, "Look, I can't control whether or not you keep using drugs. And if I lost you, that would be a wound from which I would never fully heal. But here's my boundary. Here's what I'm comfortable doing." I think when we still hold on to this hope and this idea that we can control our children, it will leak out in the things that we say. It will leak into the passive aggressive, sarcastic things that we say under our breath. And when they get triggered and reactive to those small things that we say, in essence, they're right. We're still trying to control them. We still haven't let go. We still haven't surrendered. We still haven't developed our healthy relationship with grief, which is letting go of controlling the universe, controlling other people. So do your work, and your work will inform you. And I hope I hope that gives you some comfort or some guidance, because I know you're looking for an answer. All right. Next submission goes like this. This week I am going part one. We have a lot of part one, part twos tonight. Part one. This week I am going to visit my son, 20 years old, who is partway through treatment for addiction at a wonderful place in British Columbia. And he seems to be doing well. This is his second time in treatment. He spent almost 6 months in treatment in Utah and then a year near home in Toronto after, bouncing around sober houses as he relapsed many times. I am sure that during my visit this week, he will want to talk about the future and what's going to happen next. My question for you is, what does my son need to not hear from me right now? How can I best support him at this phase? I am actively involved in my own recovery for my codependency and my dysfunctional reactions to the addiction in our family. I have been a committed member of Al-Anon for 4 years, have a therapist, participate in parent support groups, and attended an Evoke intensive last summer. Part two. That being said, I, of course, have blind spots when it comes to myself and my son. I want to maintain connection and have him see me as a source of support and see that I respect his right to choose his future. His father and I, divorced but co-parenting, have agreed to support his healthy choices like treatment and post-transition living. I would love to hear a reminder of what are your do's and don'ts when it comes to communicating with your child who is in treatment. How do we talk about this future in a way that supports his goals while also staying rooted in what is realistic, given his propensity for relapse? Really, really deep and great question. I would start off with, take the pressure off of yourself to say the right things. I've told the story about a sibling, an adult sibling, the non-identified patient in a family, being allowed to visit her sibling in treatment for substance use disorder, at a sober living facility. And she wanted to prep with me to know all the do's and don'ts. Okay. And at one point, after she set up the scene with me in our session, she said, I really don't want to say anything that will set him back. I said, why don't you come with that humility to your sibling? She was the older one. So why don't you come with that humility and say to your sister that you don't know what to say and that you're afraid of setting her back? And this non-identified patient consulting with me said, I will not do that. I have to know. I have to have some guidelines. And so we try to work on it. But I think there's a gift in not knowing. I love your humility. I love your humility. I would slow things down, and if you're I would try not to make any big decisions. I would try to listen. I might even not in front of him, but take notes of things to bring back to my sponsor and my therapist. I think the pressure of getting it right. I mean, this is it, right? Isn't it? With all that recovery, you hear it, right? The idea of getting it right, and that if you say the wrong thing, you're going to screw it all up. That's the codependency rearing its head. So you go in there, you do the best that you can, knowing what you know, and give yourself permission to not have any final conclusions, which may be unsatisfying to him. If he wants to talk about the future and you're not ready to, I'm sure he's going to be upset and angry and agitated and reactive. He might even, if it escalates, I'm not saying he would, but just to make the point, he might even threaten to walk out. He might even attack you. But that's all of his disease rearing its head. You're allowed to pause and to wait and to not know. You're allowed to say something that later on you change your mind about. I would try to be honest. I would try to encourage you to be as honest and authentic as you can be. I would give you permission and encourage you to give yourself permission to not make any big decisions in the heat of the moment, because if you're like most codependents, your qualifier is your kryptonite. Right? That's what kryptonite is. It's supposed to symbolize in the Superman story. It's a piece of the home planet of Mother Earth. And that core piece of Krypton, the home planet of Superman, reduces him to rubble. So in a very clear metaphorical way, your identified patient is your kryptonite. So you can talk about that. I had a client ask me recently if I could take them on as a new client, and I said, I can't answer that question for you. I had an opening at the time they asked me. And I said, I can't answer that question to you. I'm going to need a couple of days because my codependent, I didn't say my codependent stuff, but my instinct is to say yes and to make you happy and to give you what you need, right? So I'm going to pause and not give an answer. So slow down. It's not about you getting it right. It's about you staying in touch with yourself to maintain your integrity. And I don't mean that in the old-fashioned ethical sense of integrity. I mean it in the psychological sense of to maintain who you are in this process. And if you get triggered, all the better. If you stumble and fail, if the discussion heats up, all the better in the sense, because now you know there's still work there. And you can go back and do a post-mortem on the visit and dissect and understand where the weaknesses are still, where the triggers are still, where the unresolved trauma is. What is the thing that's going to be your red flag in the future? So I would go humbly. I would go not knowing. I would empower you to respond slowly. I would ask you to pay attention to the enormous gravitational pull you will feel inside of your body to try to make him happy and please him, to not make him upset, to not become a trigger, an excuse for his subsequent relapse or walking away from the program. And how much responsibility you take on for that, because that's your codependent work, right? And then I would leave there and I would go to my meeting and I would go to my sponsor and I would go to my therapist, all the places you're already going, and I would process it with them. And if you have success, wonderful. And if you have failures, wonderful. You deserve, you see, mom and dad, you deserve just as much love and patience and capacity for your disease and your trauma responses as does your son. You deserve it. And so I'm focused right now in answering your question on you and your heart and your wounding and your history that you have so generously shared with us in the context of your question. And lastly, I would just say the last don't is don't go there thinking you can get this perfect. Just go there knowing that this is going to be illuminating. It's going to be a litmus test. In sports, we say, we're through the practice, the scrimmages, and now the real game is being played, and it will let you know where you're at. And if you aren't very far or not as far as you'd like to be, like I said, wonderful. Then you know where your work is. And if you have successes and you get clear, that's also wonderful. So, mom and dad, and all that you were listening, you deserve, as the non identified patient, as the parent of a struggling child, or the spouse of a struggling spouse or sibling, it doesn't matter. You deserve just as much patience, just as much compassion, just as much understanding as does the identified patient who has a more obvious, perhaps more specific life-threatening behavior. All right, one more question for tonight. Somebody says, "How can we best prepare for our family visit in a couple weeks? Our daughter had a very rough transport, and we are worried about our visit to set her back." Uh, All the things I just said to the last client, I would say to you. There is a broadcast, right? You can go to the podcast library, or the if you're if obviously you're a parent at Evoke, so you can go to your parent portal and you can look up by searching terms and look for parent visit as your search term, or search any podcast app, or on our YouTube channel. Use parent visit as the keyword, because I have a whole 1 hour broadcast on how to prepare. But let me give you the most important highlights and summaries of that, because you showed up here tonight and you deserve that. Don't go trying to make it a good visit. Just like I said to the last parent, if it's a good visit, wonderful. Congratulations. I'm happy for you. Go as an opportunity to see where they're at, but more importantly, where you're at. One of my favorite responses from a mother many years ago. In fact, this was the woman who's responsible for these broadcasts starting, who encouraged me to do this and helped me find the software, and we got these started. She was taking her son during a visit. They were going to see colleges, and she described some of the things that he said and did with regard to one of the colleges they were visiting, and it sounded very regressive, very a lot of his old stuff. And she described how he kind of was showing his lack of growth and lack of maturity on the visit. And she stopped and she said, "But that's not my point. That's just to give you background and context. What I want to share with you is I responded differently." So you see, you're seeing where they're at, but more importantly, yes, more importantly, it's an opportunity to measure where you're at in this process too. So worry about your own relapse, your own regression, your own primitive coping, your own trauma responses. Go with less of an agenda, less of a goal, less of an attachment to a specific outcome, except for to learn and see where you're all at in the process. People that come with a goal or an agenda usually walk away feeling pretty resentful, pretty disappointed in the process. People that come with this open mindset walk away with a rich opportunity to learn and to grow. Don't try to have a good visit, in other words, but just have the visit that you have and see what it's like and learn from it, the positives and the negatives in the process. Great questions. Great questions. And you can see how one person's question in a very different context relates to other people's questions. All right, folks. My two books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are available on Amazon and Audible. So please check those out if you haven't already. If you would like to do a deep dive into your own work, our offer is Finding You. It's a 4-day intensive, 4.5-day intensive, goes over 5 days. The next offering is September 20th through 24th. It will sell out. I think there's one spot maybe left. So get on that if you want. It's a great springboard into your own work. I was just thinking about it this morning. I just finished co-facilitating one this week. It is months of therapy in 4.5 days. It's an immersive, powerful process. Virtually everybody said at the end, I got more out of it than I expected. It was much more than I thought. If you don't, just in case, because you can think that I have a conflict of interest because I own this program and we make whatever profit comes out of all of these. If that's an issue or a reservation, go to Onsite, one of our competitors. Go to the Meadows Recovery Program in Arizona, one of our competitors. Go to the House at Ocala, the Bridge to Recovery. Go to one of our competitors, Breakthrough at Caron Foundation in Pennsylvania. So if that at all is part of your equation, like, well, he's just selling us on a product, go to somebody else's. I cannot emphasize this next principle enough, which is this is the thing that will make the biggest difference in your life. And that means that it will make the biggest difference within your control in your child's life or in your spouse's life or in your family's life. So the in-person offering, September 20th is the next offering. We also have an online offering. It's half the time and it's about a third of the cost, and you don't have to travel. So if resources are tight, the online option gets the point across. A lot of great work is done. We started during the pandemic online. I was skeptical of it. I ran the first couple, and after I ran them, I thought we're going to do this forever. It's a great option. We have Returning to You, If You've Been Defining You, October 25th through 29th is now full. So we're opening up a next one in the spring. We're going back to the waiting list of the people who couldn't get in and giving them options for the dates in the spring. I'll list those as soon as those are solidified. And then we're going to be going back to the United Kingdom, to England in the spring of 2024 and hosting a weekend there at a wonderful, wonderful country house that we've been to a couple of times. For custom finding connection for couples or finding clarity for co-parents intensives or finding family for families, contact intensives@evoketherapy.com. We have custom programs for families, couples, and co-parents. We have support groups for current and alumni families. Our one for everybody for current and alumni. Our next offering is August 24th. That's in 2 days at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. Once a month, we have an offering for alumni only of our programs, of our wilderness program. September 26th at 6:30 p.m. is the next offering for that. And then once a month, we have an alumni meeting for our intensives alumni. September 12th at 6 p.m. is that offering. Just go to our website at evoketherapy.com/family involvement for more information. We have family treks for in-program immersive family therapy. Several days, 3 to 4 days, 2 to 3 nights long. You can do this in the middle of the program. You can do this at the end of the program. If you want more work, you can become a wilderness participant yourself. This could also be for families that aren't even in our wilderness program or that have left and want to come back for a refresher. So Family Trek is that option. Contact admissions@evoketherapy.com to find out more about that. We have coaches that work with you virtually all over the world. Parents, couples, families, or individuals. Stage of life, transitioning home, codependency, trauma. Our coaches are introduced and educated in the attachment-based model that I talk about and teach. So you can go to our website, look at the coaches there, contact coaching@evoketherapy.com for the option. That is one of our fastest growing expanding services that we offer. We ask all current parents, all current families to go to 6 12-step support groups, to try 6. Any combination of alanon.org, coda.org, familiesanonymous.org, or adultchildren.org. You can also go to refugerecovery.org. That's a Buddhist-inspired recovery group program, or the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI.org, has free classes and resources in your local communities. All of these recordings are on your podcast app or Spotify. Just search Finding You, an Evoke Therapy podcast on your favorite podcast app, or go to soundcloud.com on your computer and search Finding You there, and you can listen there. You can also go to Evoke's YouTube channel and watch the video rebroadcast of these there. You can find Evoke Therapy programs and me, Dr. Brad Reedy, on Twitter, Threads, and Instagram using the handle @EvokeTherapy and @Dr. Brad Reedy, respectively. You can find the Evoke Intensives program on Instagram using the handle @Evoke Therapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. And then our Evoke Therapy blog has new content written by our staff. The coolest thing about our blog is they're not just writing advice and telling you what you should do and how you should live. And they're all talking about their own experience of transformation. That's what I love about our company is that in therapy and attachment-based therapy specifically, you can only bring people as far as you've come. And so the culture, after all these years, is consistent where everybody understands that they've got to do their own work. It doesn't matter if you're a parent coordinator, if you're in charge of managing the field guide schedule, or you're a therapist. The blogs are based on our own work, on our own transformation. If you want to give back for people that can't afford treatment or you need help, the three charitable partners that we work with are choosementalhealth.org, sky'sthelimitfund.org, or evokefamilyfoundation.org. You can earmark your donations for a specific population or for a specific program if that be your desire. All right, my next broadcast will be August 24th. That's 2 days from now, about 48 hours, 6 p.m. Mountain Time. I'll be talking about accountability, one that I think I actually love to talk about accountability because I think there's so many things about it that are misunderstood. So I'll be talking about accountability in 2 days, 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Look forward to seeing you then. All right, folks, I hope this has been a helpful point of contact. Thank you for the question that you've sent in. You can always email suggestions, questions to webinar@evoketherapy.com, and we'll put those in the queue. And for and on behalf of the people that you love and the people that love you, thank you for showing up to these and being willing to do your work. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.